My father, he wasn't a talker. I said, Aunt Vivian, help me. Where did this name Miller come from? Like, Miller. Who's Miller? When I asked her that question, she got this really strange look on her face. And she said, well, baby, there are some stories that you just don't tell.
I'm Jorah Miller.
And I'm Paul Miller.
And this is Finding Papa. On June 24th, 1890, after years of suffering from what was only recorded as a painful, insidious disease, Centre College president Ormond Beatty passed away in his sleep. Ormond Beatty was known throughout his life as a generous and charitable man, donating so much of his wealth to Centre College and even supporting individual students who could not afford the steep tuition. Throughout his 60-year career, 18 of which spent as the Centre College president, he never lost his passion for teaching. It was said that the students were better men on account of his wise instruction and friendly counsel. Having downplayed the seriousness of his condition, never giving up teaching or his post as elder in the Second Presbyterian Church, his death was a shock to the community of Danville, Kentucky. The community, which would then step forward to create what was said to be the largest funeral procession the town cemetery had ever seen. Beatty's headstone stands tall and prominent amongst the rows of neat graves, displaying his surname in bold letters at the top, followed by his full name, his birth and death dates, as well as those of his second wife, Mildred Ann Bell. 53 years later, on October 7th, 1943, another Danville native by the name of Edward S. Miller passed away from pneumonia. But he didn't die in Danville. No, Edward Miller died in a small town nearly 400 miles away, just outside Chicago, Illinois. Miller was a medical doctor, a war veteran, a socialite, and a Mason. Though his life was full of impressive stories that deserve, nearly demand, to be told, there is hardly any information about him online. No Wikipedia page on his accomplishments, no details of a lavish funeral, no extensive family tree on Ancestry.com. All we know of him is what we can piece together from a few books and newspapers archived online, as well as the stories from descendants old enough to have met him. Oh yeah, and an unmarked grave. What exactly is the connection between these two men? One, a great educator, born, raised, and buried in Danville, Kentucky, and the other a great physician, born and raised in Danville, but who spent his adult years in Chicago, Illinois. What is the connection to be drawn between them, and why should the focus be put on their graves? Why did one man have his name gilded in history and the other erased? The answer is complicated, but it comes down to the two things so many American history books seem to favor most: race and money. You see, a very plain and simple, blink and you'll miss it fact, addressed in one line on his Wikipedia page, is that Ormond Beatty was a slaver. Edward S. Miller, on the other hand, was born enslaved. What is this podcast for?
Well, it's we're calling it Finding Papa, and it is a podcast surrounding the making of the documentary Finding Papa. So,
have you ever made a documentary before?
Never. I felt compelled to tell the story in documentary fashion. I got on the web because, I think I'm a smart guy. I can figure this out, right?
You are.
I said, well, I need to take a class. And so I Googled college in Chicago called Columbia College, which is an arts
yes.
college. My awesome nephew graduated from there, and I was like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, okay. I was like, oh, I'll take a class. And I was like, documentary filmmaking basics. Did that say $7,000? Nope. And so then I was like, oh, Udemy, making documentary, $14.95. Now that price is right. So I'm in the process of taking that class as we speak.
Is it helping?
Well, when I signed up for it, I thought it was going to be automatically like,
Grab your camera and go.
we guarantee you will have a documentary made today. Yeah. But it didn't, unfortunately, it didn't really work like that.
No.
And so in the meantime,
What are you learning about?
I'm just learning about the process, and it really is much more, you have to have, just like any good story, you have to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And you have to map out the sequences and how it's done. It's not
timeline
just like,
and the beats.
Timeline, and it's not just getting out there and like, boom, here's a documentary.
No.
So it should be interesting, and we hope to take the listeners of this podcast along for the journey.
I guess I should ask the question, have you ever made a podcast before?
Never made a podcast before?
Me neither. However, I do know that making a podcast is a little bit easier than making a documentary. So, here we are.
A little bit easier.
So, what made you want to tell this story?
When I was young, I lived next door to the Turners. They were my next door neighbors. They had a grandfather that lived with them. His name was Mr. Butts. He had a real gravelly voice.
No. Stop.
Yes. Mr. Butts had a gravelly voice. Yes.
Wow.
Yes. Mr.
How was it spelled? With a Z?
No, Butts. But Mr.
Stop! Stop! You're kidding me. I'm sorry. I know that I'm taking us off course, but I jokingly put Butts as my last name in video games. It'll be like Jorah Butts. And I can't believe there's a real person with that name. That's wild.
I thought it was super cool that Craig Turner had a grandfather. Like, I didn't have a grandfather. My mom was, well, obviously I had grandfathers, but none living, right?
Yeah.
My mom's grandmother was a single mother, and her father was a dude that was not such a good guy. And I've heard some stories about him not being a good guy. And then I would learn about my grandfather on my father's side. And his name was Edward Miller, and I thought that was super cool because my dad was Edward Miller, and my brother was Edward Miller. So all these Edward Millers in the family. So I thought that was...
Oh, you got passed over. You were born a little too late.
Yeah, there was a show that came on before you were born called Perry Mason, and it had a prosecutor on it.
I've heard of Perry Mason.
Private detective. His name was Paul, and that's where I got my name from. So
wait, no. You literally were named after a character from Perry Mason?
Yes, my sister named me.
Your sister named you?
She went to my mom and said, I like this name Paul, and so my mother's like, okay. Very romantic.
Wait, I always say that I named Jeremy. Is that correct?
You may have. I don't know.
You don't remember? I remember vividly. Wait, I must have been 4 years old. I have a memory of being 4 years old and being in the car and you guys talking about baby names and saying it had to start with a J, and I said, what about Jeremy?
Oh,
that is a memory of mine. It might be a false memory. It could be planted.
It might be spot on.
You never know.
So I thought it was super cool that Craig had a grandfather, and I started asking my dad about his father. And my father wasn't a big talker. He was an amazing father. I mean, oh my God, he was just like the quintessential Black father, supportive, hardworking, did well. He was a science teacher at the Board of Education for many years.
But he wasn't much of a talker.
Not a big talker, and especially about his background. But he would tell me a little bit of things. And I did learn the reason that I didn't know my grandfather is that he was born in 1858 in Kentucky. And my dad was born in 1920, which made my grandfather 62 when my dad was born. And that just, that exploded my brain like, what? But then I also had learned through my aunt and my dad that he was a medical doctor. So these were just words to a 18-year-old or 15-year-old or a 24-year-old. Then I got into the business of raising my own family, but it wasn't till recently when I started to do some of these ancestry searches. I started trying to find out more and more about this dude, Edward Miller, because he just haunted me.
What made you start looking into that?
One of the searches I was doing is...
No, before doing ancestry searches.
This Harvard grad, Henry Louis Gates, he's a brilliant guy, was doing this program that was about finding kind of your roots, right? And I would watch it on PBS. It was really interesting. I was like, well, let me try to see what I can find out about my family. The story that kept jumping off the page at me was this dude, Edward Miller. And so the more I searched on him, the more content it is. Because that's one of the things that when you're African American, you just don't have that much content. We don't have that kind of history. But with this story, Jordan, things were jumping off the page at me. Like every time I would read it was like, oh, Edward Miller did this and Edward Miller did that. So one of the things I found out was that I've lived in the south suburbs of Chicago, hence my Chicago Bulls hat, for the last 30 years. And when I started doing my research on Edward Miller, I had an article in one of the documents say, oh, Dr. E.S. Miller co-founded this cemetery. And it was like called Mount Glenwood Memorial Gardens Cemetery. And there are some really super famous people that are buried at this cemetery. And when I opened up the history of it, it said Mount Glenwood Cemetery was founded by Dr. E.S. Miller in 1908. I've lived in the south suburbs for 30 years, and this cemetery was literally 15 minutes from my house, right?
That's close.
My grandfather died in 1943. And I learned from my aunt that my grandfather was buried at that cemetery. When my grandmother, B, the one that was 30 years younger, passed away in about 1985 or something, my aunt said, Eddie, who was my dad, who was also Edward, we should bury Mama next to Papa. And my dad goes, nope. B landed on tough times and she sold those plots. And my Aunt Vivian was like, no, Eddie, you're wrong. They're plots. Let's go to the Mount Glenwood. And Dad, who was the older brother, said, no, Vivian, I know she sold them. Let's not waste our time. So she was buried somewhere else.
Typical.
So fast forward ahead to 2000, right before the pandemic. I was like, well, this is going to be boss, because I'm going to go to Mount Glenwood and I'm going to see this giant
monument
monument to our founder. Oh, thank you so much, Dr. E.S. Miller. I go to Mount Glenwood and I go in and I said, oh, I would love to see this where my grandfather, Edward S. Miller, who, by the way, was one of the founders of this cemetery. I want to see the giant monument, right?
This plaque at the entrance.
Yeah, and this is a cemetery that Elijah Muhammad was buried in, the famous cyclist Major Taylor, all these famous Chicagoans, Duke Slater, a lot of these famous black Chicagoans were buried in this cemetery. And my grandfather was, instrumental in this thing happening. And I was like, oh, yeah, I'm going to go see. I can't wait. So she says, okay, your grandfather's plot is, I don't know, it's on a grid system. So let's say it's M22. You come around here and you come to the end of here and he's right down this road. And I was like, awesome. So I get in my car and I drove back and I get out the car and I park it. I start walking over and I was like, okay, M19, M20, 21, M22. Nothing here. I look up again, look down, look up, look down. I go back and look at the roll number again. And then I go to the front. One of the workers was walking around. And I said, sir, they said my grandfather was M22 and circled it. And he said, oh, hold on. So he walked it off. He says, oh, yeah, no, this is M22. I said, well, there's no headstone. He said, well, sometimes people were buried without headstones. I said, oh, not my grandfather. He founded the cemetery. There would be a ginormous headstone in his honor. He said, now, one thing that happens, though, is sometimes the earth envelops. They eat these headstones, especially those who've been there for a while. So
just
maybe he
down.
had one of those, sinks down and you can't find it. So there is a service that we will do, is we will do a sonogram to see if there's something below it. And we'll call you in a week and let you know whether we found something. I was like, okay, well, thank you so much. And, I left there, sure they were going to find something. Call me back. Nope. So we can't find anything under there. He was buried without a headstone.
Mount Glenwood Cemetery was opened in 1902 and was one of the first integrated cemeteries in the Chicago area. Originally, Black families wishing to bury a loved one in a cemetery would have to do so under a false name. In 1908, 6 men met to discuss the inequalities of the funereal industry and the inaccessibility of honor in death for Black Chicagoans. Those men included Jackson Gordon, J.L. Parks, R.M. Leach, L.W. Dickerson, and one Dr. E.S. Miller, which we know is short for Edward Smith Miller, my grandfather. Leading this change was a man identified on the cemetery's website simply as Mr. Patton. While it is actually strangely hard to find any information about Mr. Patton online, I believe he must have been the original owner of the cemetery, most likely a white man. An article from the October 29, 1910 copy of the Chicago Defender explains the unrest and heavy-heartedness of a washerwoman telling how she had to pay $50 for a grave and white people $25 stirred his very being. Mr. Patton decided to give them a chance, the same as any other citizen. As my father noted, these men worked together to turn the previously racially accepting Mount Glenwood into Mount Glenwood Memorial Garden, a haven for Black mourners to not just lay their loved ones to rest, but to be able to visit them without fear of prejudice. Another Chicago Defender article describes the impact of the cemetery on a post-Reconstruction Chicago, but also pays a special note to its idyllic setting. The cemetery is a beautiful sight to behold. It is locked in, as it were, by the forest. At intervals, a train on the Chicago and Eastern Illinois Railway passes, making its appearance and disappearing as if on a stage. As of recording, I've yet to visit Mount Glenwood Memorial Gardens for myself, but I'm thankful to be living in the digital age where we can take virtual tours of Mars from our gaming chairs. So I figured I ought to just take a look at what I could see of Mount Glenwood online. It only took a few minutes of searching to realize, however, my efforts would be fruitless. It's not as if the plots are named and numbered on Google Maps. Besides, what would I be looking for, or at for that matter? A patch of grass? After all, there's no tombstone to look out for.
That blew me away. It was like, what? How could a dude who founded this cemetery not have even a little marker?
Just a tiny headstone.
That said,
just a little baby one.
Headstone, tiny.
Anything.
A rock with the name painted on it. Nothing. So that just blew me away. So that was what kind of started my curiosity. What happened? How did a guy who was enslaved, who came north during the Great Migration, who was one of the early founders of the historic Providence Hospital in Chicago, who was a Black officer in the Spanish-American War, who was one of the early people in Bronzeville, which is a historic neighborhood in Chicago. How could that dude, right, who went on to help found a Black bank, who helped found the one of the first Black life insurance companies,
who helped found the cemetery that he wound up buried in an unmarked grave.
How could that guy not have a headstone? It's impossible. So I decided that I need to try to figure out this guy's life. And at this point, I do have some theories around why that would be the case. And we'll talk about that more as we go through this podcast. But
it disturbed you.
It disturbed me to such a degree that it just drove me to find out more and more and more about this guy's life. And he had a banger of a life. And I'm anxious to tell this story. My daughter Jordan and I hope that you enjoy this podcast as we go through our process of making this documentary, Finding Papa. If you can help us along the way, and as I told Jordan earlier, feel free to write into us and let us know how we might improve this podcast, or we are
open to constructive criticism, and we are very open to people searching along with us, trying to find more records about Papa.
And we are going to bring on historians. We're going to bring on some family members. We're going to bring on some people who have some expertise in the Great Migration, have some expertise in early 1900 Chicago. So we're going to bring a lot of guests on to our show. So we hope through this process that not only are we learning about Finding Papa, but we're also learning about the kind of the quintessential African American study of the way that these Black people who were enslaved or faced discrimination through Jim Crow at the turn of the century in Chicago, how they ended up making these fabulous lives. How do you do that, right?
So you're talking about this podcast and this documentary called Finding Papa. Now, why are we calling it Finding Papa?
Okay, Jordan, say your name.
I am Jordan, also known as Jorah Miller.
And I am Paul Miller, and my father is Edward Miller, and his father was Edward Miller, and his father...
We don't know.
Who knows? We don't know. We are really haunted by this question. Now, one of the things we do know is we do know who enslaved our grandfather, her great-grandfather. As you heard in our introduction, Orman Beatty was the slaver, but his name isn't Miller, and my name isn't Paul Beatty.
You made an interesting point that your name is not Beatty. Now, why do you feel the need to clarify that?
Well, as some of you know, maybe not many of you know, but many of your African-American listeners would know, is that historically, we got our names from our slave owners. So if our slave owner was Miller, our names would be Miller. If our slave owners were Beatty, typically our names would be the same. We would go through and our names would be Beatty or Johnson or whoever the slave owners were. Obviously, our heritage, our names through our heritage would be African names. And so by us finding the fact, and we've been able to document where the enslaver of our family's name was Orman Beatty, which over the course of this podcast we'll learn more about. You would think that if he were our enslavers, we would come out of that and our last names would be Beatty and not Miller.
Yeah.
So there's not just one Miller, there's three Millers. And those three Millers were born over a course of 8 years. So we know for a fact that there was a significant Miller presence in our great-grandmother's life that made my grandfather.
You're saying that your grandfather was one of 3 children, and those 3 children were all named Miller. But with this being called Finding Papa, is Papa what your dad called him?
Yes, my dad called him Papa. My grandmother called him Dr. Miller, but that's a whole nother story.
We will end up getting into your grandmother.
We will get into my grandmother.
But how old was your grandmother, real quick? Your grandfather was Papa was 62.
62.
And B.
My grandmother, I believe, B. B was, I believe, 29.
Okay.
So there was a little bit of an age difference between them.
Just a little bit. It's funny. I went weeks planning this podcast with my father, thinking nearly the whole time that Papa was what he called his grandfather, as a grandchild. Why I was under that misconception, I have no idea. Maybe because I always called my father Dad or Daddy, and Papa just seems more like a grandparent name to me. I am now well aware of the timeline and that the math ain't mathin' on my father calling Edward S. Miller anything at all. Living from 1858 to 1943, Papa missed the birth of all of his grandchildren, my dad in particular by a good 16 years. One of the many downsides of having children in your 60s. I know it must be sad for my father, not having gotten to experience the love of a grandparent in his childhood or reap the rewards of their counsel as an adult. I was fortunate enough to meet both sets of my grandparents, though my dad's parents passed away when I was fairly young. Sitting here, thinking about my father's thirst to know Edward S. Miller, I feel similarly about Edward Miller Jr. I don't remember a great deal about my pop-pop. That's what my siblings and cousins called our grandfather. It's what my niece now calls my dad. What I do remember, however, checks out with my father's report. He was not a big talker. He was incredibly intelligent and had diverse interests. He was a science teacher and a Star Trek fan. I don't remember him for his riveting conversations, but I was also a precocious child, more likely to talk at a grandparent than with them. But I remember his soft, powder white hair and comforting presence in the corner of the room. I remember making strawberry shortcakes with him before sitting down to play hours of solitaire on his fancy new desktop computer. I remember his sometimes mischievous smile and the wrinkles in the corners of his eyes. Whenever I think of my grandparents who have passed, Pop-Pop, grandmother, and my mom's father, Granddaddy, I feel a tinge of guilt that I didn't make the most of my time with them. As a kid, I didn't understand the true depths of the pain I would feel with them gone, but I am grateful for the time I did have, and I'm thankful that their stories live on in my mother and father, and in my aunts and uncles and cousins. Sadly, this is not the case for my paternal great-grandfather. He died nearly 80 years ago, and anyone who knew him has assumedly passed on. So here we are, blowing dust off archives, trying to breathe new life into the story of Edward S. Miller, hoping it won't be lost to the annals of time like a tombstone to the wet earth. Or worse, erased, like a black name in a white household on an 1850 U.S. Census. Your great-grandmother, she was named Susan Penman, correct? How far back can we trace?
I was able to trace our family back to the late 1700s, a woman by the name of Nancy Bell Penman, and she was married to Barry Penman, and she was my great-great-grandmother, and she was married to Barry Penman. But when I say married, it's married in a very loose fashion.
Slave masters
because
making
they were enslaved
slaves
people.
Marry each other thing.
Right.
You never really know.
And we don't know whether it's a real, whether it was an actual.
Because there are plenty of slaves that did marry for love, but there are also plenty of slaves that were forced into marriages to produce children to have more slaves.
Yeah, to mate, right. But one of the concerns that Jordan and I had is when we were researching this project. Jordan, talked a little bit about some of the challenges you have when we go back to look at some of these slave schedules.
Yeah, so essentially, to the pro-slavery South, slaves were not considered people. So while enslaved people were recorded on every census from the first one in 1790, it wasn't until 1860's census that their names would appear. The format of the US Census has changed every year, literally every year. between, at least between 1790 and 1860. In the beginning, the only name listed on every census was the head of household. So every other person was numbered by categories like age, race, sex.
Which is typically an old white man, right?
Yeah, so the head of the household, the old white man's name would be on the list. His wife, his children, any slaves, any free, help, were all listed as categories. In 1850, census records began recording the names of every free person in the household. So all of the white people would be named. The mother, father, children would all be named in the census. And the slaves were still just kept as numbers. Then, also in 1850, documents called slave schedules were instituted, listing the name of every slave owner, yet still slaves were counted just in categories like sex, age, and then whether they were black or mulatto. If you don't know, the term mulatto is what mixed race people were called. It's a term that is still used derogatorily to this day to refer to light-skinned black women. These schedules would list whether a slave was, and I quote, deaf, dumb, blind, insane, or idiotic. The number of fugitives, enslaved people who were able to escape, as well as manumitted, or freed slaves, were also recorded. And then finally in 1860, the names of every person residing in a household were listed, including enslaved people. So that presents a challenge.
So I find it fascinating that we were not recorded.
Literally didn't exist.
Did not exist as people according to the government.
What, you want me to record the names of all my cattle?
Well, you're gonna have me name my horses next?
Name all the frogs in the bayou?
Yeah, it's crazy.
You know, that poses a challenge. That poses a challenge for any African American person trying to find their history. I mean, white people can just say, I can trace back to the kings of England, and we're like, great, I can trace back to 1850. I think a lot about reparations. Anytime reparations are discussed, it turns into, what? You think white people should just give black people money just because slavery? You guys aren't slaves now. And it's like, so first of all, we're still affected by slavery, even though it's over. Second of all, slavery was not that long ago, my dudes. Your grandfather was a slave. Mm-hmm. Then that means that your father was
one generation
away
removed
from slavery. Okay, and you are 2 generations removed from slavery. And that makes me a 31-year-old woman living in 2023, only 3 generations away from slavery. Yeah.
That's insane, yes. It's insane.
So I think about reparations, and I'm like, how about putting money towards helping black people find their ancestry? How about black people all getting a free ancestry test? As that. But as if the U.S. government wouldn't use it for nefarious purposes. Let's be real.
You know they would.
They would. So that challenge presented to African Americans to find their ancestry makes it very difficult to tell what relationships were genuine, as well as because there was not a recording of the name of every child born before a certain point, we have no idea who fathered a lot of black children. The institutionalized rape in slavery was abundant, and thus a lot of children came out with the slave owner's last name, and all of the slaves would also have the slave owner's last name because they were his property. But that kind of obscures who is named that last name because of rape and who's named that last name just because of ownership. Would you like to talk about how that affects our search for Papa's father?
It makes it hard. Well, it makes me spend hours and hours and hours trying to piece together clues, right? Mm-hmm. Context clues like, Orman Beatty's wife's name was Mildred Ann Bell. My maternal grandmother's last name was Bell. Did Orman Beatty teach a young person by the name of Miller? Did Orman Beatty have a nephew named Miller?
Like, I know that they're not around now, but did you ask your parents?
Well, I never asked that of my parent because I was not smart enough to ask when my dad was living. But I did ask my Aunt Vivian. My dad was born in 1920. He had a sister that was born in 1924. She was lovely. Her name was Vivian Lewis. She was a mathematics teacher. She's one of the most brilliant people I've ever met, right? And I asked her this one question, and it haunts me that I don't have this on film, but I remember like it was yesterday. I was like, I'm Vivian. I'm just so confused by this one thing that hopefully you can help me with. And she was like, sure, honey, what's the issue? I said, I cannot figure out where the last name Miller came from. My grandmother, Susan Penman, married another guy after the end of the Civil War, a black guy, but his last name was Davis. Where did the name Miller come from? She said these words to me. She said, baby, I asked my Aunt Fanny that same question, and her eyes started welling up, and she said, baby, there are some stories that are just not meant to tell.
Okay.
I don't know what that means, Jordan. It's all anecdotal.
Yeah.
But I do know this much, is that my dad was born in 1858, and my grandmother was born in 1842. That makes her 16 when my granddad was born. You have to be pregnant for a year. So this is a 15-year-old making children with this
Whoever
Miller
Miller
guy.
is.
I feel like I owe it to my grandfather to tell the story. I feel like I owe it to my great-grandmother to tell the story. I just really feel invested deeply in the roots of this story to make sure that as best as I can, 150 years later, that the truth be told about
Whatever
Miller and
happened
finding
here.
Papa, and right, yeah. And the juxtaposition between the headstone for Orman Beatty, the slaver, and the fact that my grandfather has no headstone in his cemetery in Thornton, Illinois, is not lost on me.
The juxtaposition between their two gravestones and the lives that they led and the amount of information that you can find about them online. Orman Beatty's Wikipedia page literally only has one line about slavery. One line about having owned slaves. This man owned people. He enslaved people. And there is a Wikipedia page talking about all of the amazing things that he's done. And one line about the fact that he owned slaves.
Yeah.
Our grandfather and great-grandfather escaped slavery, became a medical doctor, became a soldier, became the founder of all of these black institutions. And he is a footnote in the story of Orman Beatty's legacy. There's something wrong there. So we're seeking to right that wrong with Finding Papa. What do you think are the first steps to creating the documentary?
There is a library in Louisville, Kentucky. Louisville, Kentucky is about 45 minutes from Danville, Kentucky, where my grandfather grew up.
Where Susan Penman was enslaved.
Yes. Orman Beatty, as Jordan said, is crazy famous in Kentucky as the 20-year president of this fairly large college called Center College.
There's actually a scholarship in Orman Beatty's name.
Yeah, $5,000 scholarship in the name of Orman Beatty. So we're going to take a trip to visit that college because Orman Beatty has a collection of papers at this college.
And you can't access them online.
That is correct. You cannot access them online. Therefore, we need to actually take a physical trip down there. We don't care about his collection of fine watches. We want to know about his collection of people. So,
Buried him under a giant headstone.
So we want to find out what we know about that.
Yeah, a lot of people idolize these great men, quote unquote great men, from the South, knowing full well that they owned people. A lot of people are happy to just look over that. I mean, it's the Hamilton effect. Let's not talk about slavery except for in these 2 lines. It's easy to ignore the dark parts of our history. It would be nice if the legacies of the people that these great men enslaved, the people that these great men abused, that these great men raped, it would be nice if their stories could be told too.
And can we add on the fact that much of their fortunes were created on the back of our families? So when they always talk about that Head Start that was given, that's the Head Start we're talking about.
Just a small $100,000 loan from my father. Exactly. Oh yeah, I'm a self-starter. I am a self-made man. I pulled myself up from my bootstraps with my slave's help.
Right. Yes. Thank God for my slave.
And all of the money that Adam Beatty, Ormond Beatty's father, made on his plantation, that then was split between him and his siblings. All of that money you're saying had nothing to do with you getting your start.
Yes. Crazy.
So.
Crazy.
Yeah. So what would you say your main goals are with this podcast and with this documentary?
My major goal is to really find out where the Miller name came from. I think that would honor my grandfather if I could get the truth out in terms of who this was, right? That's one of my goals. My other goal is to document this meteoric rise from a guy that was born enslaved. So many things that were the story of Black America were his story. Reconstruction in the South, that was his story. The Great Migration North, that was his story. The first Black regiment to be able to fight in the Spanish-American War, that was his story. The rise of Bronzeville. Everyone hears about the Harlem Renaissance, but Chicago had a very similar Renaissance. They call it the Great Metropolis, of which Bronzeville was the center of that. And the fact that he was a medical doctor in a turn of a century where there was smallpox. He lived in Chicago when they had the Chicago race riots of 1919. This story, I think, is parallel to the story of so many amazing Black people who rose from slavery and then made these amazing lives, right? Yeah. And we hear a lot of the tough stories and the bad stories, but what a thing to rise from slavery and then not only you had this amazing life, but you were able to pass that legacy on to your children, and they were able to pass it on to their children, and that the next generation, because of your excellence. I went through my podcast to kind of tell the story of Edward Miller, but also be able to tell this great story of the rise of the Black community from the times of like Reconstruction all the way through where we are today.
Building up his community, building up his family.
Building the community, building his family, building a legacy, all of these things I'd like to be able to document through our documentary and just show how powerful and how resourceful and how resilient Black people were and are.
Yeah, I think my goal for this podcast is to get a Wikipedia page.
Love it.
I think that if Ormond Beatty has a Wikipedia page, Edward S. Miller deserves one too.
I love that as a goal.
It's funny because you could just create one, but
well,
I want someone else to create one for us because our podcast is a success and our documentary is a success. And other people want to help in continuing to tell the story of Edward S. Miller.
Love it.
Until next time, hug your loved ones close. Learn more about one another while we're here on Earth together. Document your family history, and don't ever let it be erased. Thanks for listening.